Hi everybody, we got a video for you to talk about some of the maintenance items on the cars. I've been getting some emails from people that are new to RC asking what items do they need to kind of pay attention to as they run the cars. And if you are racing the cars, we recommend doing this maintenance stuff every week. So we're going to use the sprint car for this video. Everything that we talk about is going to transfer over to the midget. All the suspension and most of the parts are the same on both cars, so everything we talk about will just go over to the midget. So we're going to start on the front axle. A couple things that you're going to want to really do on the front axle. If you are racing the cars, we do recommend going to the solid kingpins instead of the screws. You can run the screws, it's no problem, but what you'll find is that you'll get quite a bit of play over time, so you can upgrade to the optional kingpins here. When you do run the kingpins, both the kingpin and the axle are steel, so you can get some galling in here if you don't keep some lube on these kingpins. So what we recommend doing is taking the axle out of the car, spraying both ends off really good with some RC motor spray, make sure that's clean, make sure everything is dry. Then what you're going to want to do is get a little micro oiler similar to this. You can get them at your local hobby shop, or if they don't have them, you can get them online. Just get one with the needle tip on it like this. You're going to push up on the spindle, and it's going to have just a little bit of a gap at the top. Just put that oiler tip right in there and put about 2 to 3 drops of oil on there and do both sides. And then just work the spindles back and forth to get that oil down inside of there. And you'll know you'll feel it kind of get down in there, it'll really start to free up. Just wipe off any excess oil and you're good to go. And we recommend doing that every week. The other thing you can do is if you run the adjustable tie rod, sometimes if these spindles will get tweaked a little bit in a hard crash and you'll feel a little bit of a bind there. We recommend just taking a plier or a needle nose, something like this, and then just grab onto the threaded part and just rotate the axle a little bit back and forth. What that'll do is that'll get those rod ends nice and flat and make sure they're straight, and then make sure that's free. You can also get some flashing on these ends right here when the screws are in there, because they run on the threads of the screws. So you may get a little flashing. If you do, just take an X-Acto knife and kind of just trim that flashing off of there, and everything is good to go. But just make sure the axles moves back and forth real free, just like this. The other thing to look for is on the spindle axles, these can bend. They are pretty small, so we could use small bearings in the car so we didn't have this massive bearing up there. You can tweak these, they can bend. So what you'll want to do is grab the car and just look at the front end, and if your tire has excessive camber either direction, that probably means that the spindle axle is bent. You can bend those back a little bit. You can maybe get like one bend out of them. Eventually they will break, but if you don't want to bend it or take the chance, just get a new set of spindles and the axles are straight. The other area to look at is the radius rods. Just make sure all of the radius rods are free on the car. What we recommend doing to check this is just pop the shocks loose, like on this car here, and just push the rear axle up and down, and it should go up easy and just fall right back down under its own weight. Do that with the front and the rear. If anything is tight, you can squeeze these rod ends a little bit on the tie rods. We have a video on that explains that. Basically, you're just going to take a little plier and just give those a little squeeze, very, very light. You don't want to squeeze them too much or they won't stay on the balls. The other thing you want to do is make sure that the shocks are nice and free. Take the shocks off, take the springs off. We got a video on this as well. Pop the cap off, undo the rod end a little bit when you push this up so you can get to the O-ring. Put a little bit of lube on there, pull it back in, and make sure the shock is nice and free. If those get bound up at all, they can cause the car to drive really weird, so really watch that. The other thing too is if you are running an adjustable upper radius rod here, if you run a lot of caster in the car, this drag link here, if this doesn't rotate freely, like this is right here, you have a bind there. If you have a lot of caster in there, what it'll do is it'll bind right here where the end is. So what you may have to do is put a little bit of heat to that, and then just tweak that up a little bit, so it kind of follows the amount of caster that you have, and just make sure that rotates free. Make sure all the steering is free on the car. If it's not free, it won't center correctly, and the car will be hard to drive. The other thing too is as you kind of got the front end out and you take the rear end out, just make sure the frame's not broken. We grab it a little bit, just kind of give it a little bit of a twist. A lot of people have run the cars with a broken frame, like if you break it during a race night or something, you can keep running the car usually. If it's not too bad, and then change it during the week. We do have updated side rails for the car that have a little bit more bracing in the front, and they are made out of a little bit softer material too. So check that. When you have the rear end out of the car, just make sure the rear end rolls nice and free. It should roll super free just like that because it's got bearings in it. The one thing, if it doesn't roll free, make sure you take it all apart, clean the bearings, clean the gears, oil everything back up. When you put the cases back together, we don't recommend tightening these screws super tight. Just run them down maybe till they're snug, and you can even back them off a little bit if you want. Just make sure everything is nice and free, nothing binds up. When you do put everything back together, sometimes these bearings get a little bit, especially, or the two bearings on the compound gear, get in there at a little bit of an angle. So if you do have that, if it is bound up a little bit, take a solid wrench, like this one here. This is an Allen wrench with a solid handle, and just tap on these bearing pockets on both sides. Give them 3 or 4 taps, pretty good. I mean, you can hit them pretty hard, and it'll seat those bearings, and then just try rolling it. A lot of times that'll free that up. But if it's not free, just check everything. Again, make sure the screws aren't too tight. Also, when you have the motor out, make sure you oil the bearings on the motor. You probably only need about 1 drop of oil on each side, on each bearing. You don't need much. They're not very big bearings. So just oil that up. When you go to put the motor back in the car, make sure that you don't, when you tighten up the motor screws, don't over tighten these screws. If you over tighten these screws, what it can do is it can tweak the motor a little bit, and it'll mess with the gear mesh right here between the motor and the compound gear. So make sure you don't over tighten those. That's very critical. The other thing you can do is there is a little bit of play over time. These screws will, get a little bit bigger, the holes will get a little bit bigger from the screws. Sometimes if you put this in, you might get the motor too tight to the compound gear. What we recommend doing is just barely tighten these motor screws down, and you can put like a little wrench in between the motor and the gear case here, and just kind of tweak the motor out a little bit. Just pry it out a little bit, and that'll just set that gear mesh a little bit better here so it doesn't bind up on you. Another thing you want to do is just make sure that all the wing mounts are good. The cars do take some pretty good tumbles if your car gets stepped on, anything like that. Sometimes these wing mounts will break on the bends or around the screws, so just make sure the front and the rear wing mounts are good. The last item we want to cover is the tires. So some people have said that after running the car a little bit, it becomes hard to drive. It gets a little bit loose, especially if you're running on carpet or anything like that. So the tires will get like a little bit of a film on them after running because they're rubber and they are sticky. It pretty much, picks up anything. So what we recommend doing for the tires, we don't recommend running tire dope on these cars if you can get away with it. The tire dope just causes a lot of issues, especially for new racers coming in. They just have no idea what that stuff is. The stuff smells sometimes, depending on which one you use. So it's just kind of better to stay away from it if you can. What we've found works really good is take a rag, put it under water, get it nice and wet, wring it out a little bit, and then clean the tires with the wet rag. And you can just grab the rear tire and just, spin the other tire and just clean it. Go both directions so you make sure you get everything out of the grooves. Do both rear tires really good. And then the fronts, it's a little bit easier to tip the car on its side and take the rag and just wipe them just like this. And just wipe them really good. You can go both directions for this, just there again to make sure it's really cleaned out. And just try that instead of, going the tire dope route. The tires are very, very sticky, because they are pretty good rubber. So they do have a lot of traction, but if they are dirty or if they got a film on them, they will get slick. So try that if you're having any traction issues. That's it for this video. If you have any questions on anything in here, hit us up on our support email or on Facebook Messenger, Twitter, Instagram, and we'll get right back to you. Make sure you keep watching our website and social media pages for new products coming out, and thanks for watching.